don't want to turn this into an argument about one particular island off the northern coast of Estonia. If I stamp on your toe, I haven't attacked your toe, I've attacked you. Yep. And that's how NATO should react to these.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today on day 1310 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we are at a point where the Russians have exceeded 1.1 million casualties. And we're very privileged to be talking to an old friend of the show, Edward Lucas. Now, Edward, I understand you're a writer and a consultant specialising in European and transatlantic security, and your expertise includes cybersecurity, energy, espionage, information warfare, all the sort of stuff that I'm in, Russian and foreign and security policy, and you're a former senior editor at The Economist and a senior fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, and an old friend of the show. Welcome back.
Nice to be here. Thanks, Philip.
We've had an extraordinary 24 hours, in fact less than 24 hours, as Donald Trump has stood up in the United Nations and that was and had a meeting with President Zelensky of Ukraine, and seems to have changed his tune completely. What are you making of it?
It's black coffee time, isn't it? I sat down yesterday morning, Tuesday, to sketch out my Times column, which was a kind of long lament about the feeble European response to this series of airspace intrusions and other provocations that have been inflicted on us in recent days, which of course are nothing compared to what Ukraine is going through, but still pretty startling if you're just trying to use Copenhagen Airport. And then in the evening, the news broke of, first of all, Trump's speech, and then his meeting with Zelensky and his extraordinary post on Truth Social. And so that is, if not a game changer, certainly an eye-opener. And we have to parse it quite carefully and look at what's being said. It's really welcome to have some hawkish rhetoric from Trump. That's much better than dovish rhetoric. It's nice to see him dumping this lamentable sort of both sides, sometimes even worse than that, where he's accused Ukraine of starting the war. But in the end, what matters is deeds, not words. Yep. And there is not even the promise from Trump of tougher sanctions on Russia or more aid for Ukraine. So I think that in the end, we drink our coffee, but go back to the same problem that we've had before this 24 hours started.
But he hasn't withdrawn support from Ukraine. He's lauded the fact that European NATO nations are paying the United States for weapons. It seems, and it's always difficult reading between the lines of what Donald Trump says, but it seems between the lines he may have removed some of the restrictions that there have been on the use of US weapons inside Russia itself, and Ukraine is successfully attacking lots of Russian targets, the Ukrainian manufactured weapons. But Donald Trump seems to be getting frustrated, there's a better phrase, but frustrated at Vladimir Putin, possibly because Vladimir Putin is holding him back from being nominated properly for a Nobel Peace Prize. Are you seeing that frustration?
I think Trumpology is as weak and unscientific discipline as criminology. I mean, we have to indulge in it a bit. And I think clearly the Alaska summit wasn't the great success that Trump was hoping for. And if he's going to get a Nobel Peace Prize for something, it probably won't be for fixing this war. And Putin has, to some extent, given him the middle finger. And all those play a role. But we also see that what was a security alliance based on shared history, shared interests and shared values is turning into a kind of sort of insurance policy, or possibly just a buyer's club for weapons. And I'm delighted if the United States is continuing to sell weapons to European allies and to Ukraine in the quantity and quality that's desired. That's not at all the same as pitching in to defend Ukraine against Kremlin imperialism. So we have a sort of some gratifying nuances, but against a picture of a very big and unwelcome shift. The Atlantic reported this week that Elbridge Colby, the brains of the Pentagon, is saying don't sell scarce weapons to Europeans. We're going to need them in the Asia-Pacific region. So there's a lot going on here. And I think it's also important to underline that Ukraine is now a really serious weapons producer. What Ukrainians need more than anything else is money to produce even more of the excellent weapons they've got. And there may be some high-end intelligence or special bits and pieces they need. But the idea that the Ukrainians are grateful for every lump of Western equipment they get is years out of date now.
Well, it's interesting. Donald Trump, I think, may have begun to realise that the Ukrainians are actually very capable and are hitting lots of targets. And I think the amount of support that the Ukrainians need from the United States is diminishing quite rapidly. And that's being recognised. But that political support is critical. And the other thing that Donald Trump came out with was a statement to say that NATO should shoot down Russian aircraft or missiles that go into NATO territory in the future, which again seems to be a very bold statement coming out. Do you think with the Shahab drone incursion into Poland, the MiG-31 incursion into Estonian airspace, we've now got drones coming from Russian contracted ships going into Copenhagen airport and possibly up into some of the Scandinavian airports. Do you think the response that we've seen from the international community and NATO has been sufficiently strong? Will Putin listen to it?
Well, evidently not, because these provocations are continuing. If we had done something that was really decisive at any point, either on those attacks you mentioned or many others in the past, Putin would be nursing his bruises and thinking, I'm not going to try that again. What they did to me really hurt. So clearly we're not doing enough. And I think it's worth having a bit of a historical perspective here. We are used to the United States being the great spine stiffener and the great cheerleader of European security. And what we're seeing from President Trump doesn't really bear comparison with John F. Kennedy going to Berlin in 1963 and saying, Ich bin ein Berliner. And it doesn't bear comparison with Ronald Reagan's Evil Empire speech of 83 or Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. We are clutching at straws here. There was a big worry that the United States might be so gun-shy that they would tell Saka, the American general, who's the supreme allied commander in NATO, that you're not to shoot down any Russian warplanes with Russian people on board. Maybe drones are okay, but not a manned, crewed aircraft. And that would have been very worrying. And it had some European allies thinking, well, maybe we need different chains of command. If it's in our airspace for 12 minutes and we've got to get both Thacker and perhaps also Prime Minister Meloni, because it's an Italian F-35 that's locked onto this intruder, that's an awful lot of political decision-making in a very short space of time. So maybe we actually do need much shorter and tighter chains of command. And one thing I'm advocating in my column tomorrow, now that I've actually written it, is that we should change the rules of engagement so that the authority to shoot down these planes is decentralised and much lower. And that's still lacking. But I think the broader question is we don't want to turn this into an argument about one particular island off the northern coast of Estonia. If I stamp on your toe, I haven't attacked your toe, I've attacked you. And that's how NATO should react to these.
But we've had in the last 10 days 2 instances of NATO's Article 4 being called. Now that's unprecedented. From a geopolitical perspective and from a NATO perspective, and both focused on Russian activity. Do you think Vladimir Putin's going to listen to what's effectively a collective finger-waggling and stiff letter coming out of all of the NATO ambassadors? Or do we need to do something a little bit more firm and militaristic?
Well, clearly we do. And I think that these attacks should really be seen not as specific breaches of particular airspace or burning down a particular warehouse or beating up at a particular individual. What they all have in common is they're attacks on our decision-making. And they are there to expose weakness of will and disunity, both disunity between countries and disunity within countries. And we have, I think, to some extent fallen into a trap of saying that we'll respond to this with an Article 4 consultation, after which nothing happens. And Article 4 sounds quite imposing, as indeed does Article 5, until you invoke it, you have a meeting and then nothing happens, at which point it loses its sort of moral power. So I think it's what the most important thing for us is to get away from the idea that meetings and stern resolutions and reprimands have any kind of real force. What we need to do is to think what will persuade Putin not to do this again, and then think of several things that fall into that category and then do them. And this will be very risky, and it will be painful, and it will lead to escalation from the side of the Kremlin, because having taught the Kremlin not to take us seriously, we now have to teach the Kremlin that it does take us seriously. So it's going to be a very unpleasant months ahead of us if we choose to do this. But there's no alternative.
So do you think these are deliberate acts by Vladimir Putin to try and test the political reaction and political resolve of the West, as well as the military reaction? And what do you think Putin, now sitting back and watching what's going on, is actually making of the statements in the United Nations, of the NATO reaction, and what world leaders are saying?
Well, I think it's very informative for Putin. So he's seen, first of all, that there isn't the sort of American reaction that we would have seen 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, if you imagine if this had happened under George W. Bush or under Clinton or under Obama even, you would have had the Vice President or the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State or several of them all flying into Europe. You would have had some serious smacks delivered to Russia, and probably a sort of demonstrative reinforcement of the American military presence in Europe, and probably other things as well. And we haven't had any of that. So the first lesson for Putin is that America is basically disengaged from European security, except as an arms salesman. That's an important lesson. It's also very clear that some countries have the means to deal with this on their own. That's Poland, for example, and that's really serious. It's also clear that Denmark, and I would argue also Sweden, are pretty clueless when it comes to these attacks on their infrastructure. We've had a whole range of things going wrong in Sweden this year, which are not viewed through a national security lens. They're viewed as sort of possible outbreaks of hooliganism or just random acts of misfortune, and there's no strategic response to Sweden from them. And that's all super useful for the Kremlin to know. There's also the difference in perceptions from countries that still take the United States very seriously and are hoping against hope that Trump's still going to be there for them. That would perhaps include Lithuania, and others which seem to have basically decided that America's a busted flush. And according to the excellent piece by Gideon Rachman in the FT this week, that would include Estonia, and perhaps the feeling is mutual. The Pentagon doesn't seem to like Estonia very much. Now, these aren't set in stone, but these are all useful clues for the Kremlin. And they also will see that the public opinion is not very happy about these sort of attacks, and they may think that they can bring home to the Danish population, for example, that the admirable policy of the Danish government in buying advanced weapons, reinforcing Bornholm, sending lots of weapons to Ukraine, and so on and so forth, all this is going to have a very considerable cost of inconvenience for your average Dane, and that may start putting some pressure on the Danish government from below. I shall know more about this when I'm back from Copenhagen on at the end of the weekend. I'm flying there tomorrow.
Yeah, Copenhagen's a lovely city. The other thing,
not where I'm going.
The other thing that Putin has or will be watching is Donald Trump. The one lever he could pull immediately is an economic lever, putting additional sanctions on Russia, taking action against the shadow fleet, taking action against those nations that are buying Russian oil and gas products, therefore putting further economic pressure on. But he's tied that to European nations stopping their import of Russian oil and gas products. Do you think that's a clever move by Trump to embarrass European nations, or is it a clever move by Trump to avoid making a difficult decision in dealing with the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians at a time when he's focusing on other things?
I think in the past it was more the former, and now it's more the latter. It was quite right of Trump to belabour the Germans for their appalling gas and natural gas dependency on the on Russian pipeline gas imports. Excuse me, and it's quite right to highlight what still needs to be done. Actually, the two countries that are most guilty of importing Russian oil are Slovakia and Hungary, which happen to be the ones that are, where Trump has the most influence and Brussels has the least. And I think it's unrealistic to expect Europe to put 100% tariffs on all Chinese imports. So he's sort of demanding stuff that he knows Europe won't do in order that the United States doesn't have to do what it ought to do. But actually, most of what needs to happen is in European hands. Europe can deal with the shadow fleet. Europe can send more money to Ukraine. Europe can seize that $300 billion or £240 billion of Russian central bank assets, and as my friend Hugo Dixon has outlined, use that as collateral for a big loan to Ukraine, and that would be a game changer if Ukraine had hundreds of billions of the frozen Russian assets. We here in Britain could start off just by actually doing something about the £2.5 billion from the forced sale of Chelsea Football Club. And every time I ask the government about this, they say we're working at pace, which is true, but it is snail's pace. And so there's an awful lot we can actually do. I think the fundamental problem here is we don't have Russian tanks on our streets. This is not Tallinn 1940. Where it's negotiating a surrender. We have the ability to do anything we want to do. The only problem is political will. And we are floundering, trying to find everybody to blame for the fact we don't have the political will that we need. And we're blaming Trump because he won't do things when there's so much that we should do, and we should just get on with it.
Yes, well, political at pace is not measured by a stopwatch, it's measured by calendars, and multiple calendars.
Maybe a portable sundial would be helpful.
Well, yes, I think one that works through several winters as well would be good. But behind all of this, and behind the political rhetoric and everything else, there's this move to try and get some military package that could come in if there's a peace agreement, a ceasefire agreement inside Ukraine. But underpinning any ceasefire agreement, I think what European nations want is some form of American backstop. And President Zelensky yesterday in the United Nations turned around and talked about the importance of a security architecture and the US backstop being there, providing that guarantee, but then sort of linked it to what had happened with the Budapest memorandum, and you bringing it all together. And do you think that anything that is put down in writing as an international agreement, because of the fact that the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia and others have failed to live up to the international agreement and the Budapest memorandum, it means that anything else on paper is just completely meaningless in the future?
Correct.
So what's the solution? Is there one?
Well, I think we need to stop this sort of touching but deluded and actually quite damaging belief that we can solve this with bits of paper. And we've seen that NATO, which is the most solemn treaty-based security alliance imaginable, actually falls apart quite quickly when political things change and there are European countries that are de facto non-members of NATO, and the United States, as I argued earlier, is basically walking away, except perhaps as an arms salesman and in some sense a provider of high-end intelligence. So in the end, it's about, do we have the political will? Are we willing to go to war with Russia to defend ourselves? That's the question. If we are willing to go to war with Russia to defend ourselves, then we should be supporting Ukraine to the hilt and supporting them right now, not after some ceasefire, but while they've got a chance of, as President Trump now says, regaining most, all, or even more than their lost territories. The idea that we suddenly will gain the political will after some kind of arm-twisted ceasefire or armistice seems to be very odd. That our risk appetite will go down rather than up. We'll be even less willing to confront Russia, and anything we do deploy in Ukraine as some kind of tripwire or stabilization force is just a sitting duck for Russia to attack and expose our lack of defense and deterrence and those flaws in our decision making that I was talking about earlier.
Now, we're seeing changes in Europe's approach to the United States. Lots of people are kowtowing to Donald Trump to try and keep him on side. We're also seeing Europe coming together in a way that I don't think we've seen beforehand. Do you see Europe adapting? Do you see Europe getting closer together from a geopolitical security perspective? I don't want to say defence perspective, because Europe has got NATO that provides it that defence umbrella for most European nations, not all. But is Europe coming together collectively? And do you think old political rivalries, national rivalries, are something that are becoming increasingly overcome, or are they still influencing decision-making in an unhelpful way?
I think there's no one Europe, and I think we are seeing the outlines of a kind of post-NATO Europe, which may use some of the existing NATO structures if they're convenient and suitable, but will also be very clear that it doesn't want to depend on the United States any more than it has to, and ideally very little or not at all. And that's largely the North European countries. There's a bit of a question mark over France. There's a bit of a question mark still over Germany, although less now that we have Friedrich Merz in charge. And there are countries like Romania, which are, for now, are very strong allies, and countries in the middle which are not allies at all, like Hungary and Slovakia. Big question mark over the Czech Republic, up with the elections coming up, and so on. So it's a moving picture, and I don't think the cake is anywhere near baked yet. But I do think that the threat from Russia has basically consolidated Europe, even though it's proved to divide the Atlantic Alliance. And I also think that there's an important point that political polarization seems to go down in the face of geopolitical danger. And I was very pleased that this stonking row between the Polish Deputy Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, my friend Radek Sikorski, and the new president and his advisors, which was only 2 weeks ago, was lighting up Washington as they both went on rival visits to the United States, insulting each other on social media. There's nothing like that drone incursion to see Poland speaking with one voice. So now I think Putin looks at that and he thinks, okay, I need to be careful here. I need division within countries and division between countries. And there's plenty still around. There's plenty of, there's latent hostility between Lithuania and Poland for historical reasons. There's latent hostility between Poland and Germany for historical reasons. There's all sorts of other worries and difficulties. And Putin is always looking for those divisions, whether they're historical, linguistic, ethnic, religious, demographic, regional, whatever. If he sees a division in a country, he will go in there and try and exploit it. And I think that we need to think not just about the cohesion of our existing and particularly our new alliances, but also our cohesion inside countries, our political and social cohesion. Because in the end, when we're facing these sub-threshold attacks, disruption and clandestine or overt attacks on energy, transport, information, payment systems, whatever, that's when resilience and the cohesion it relies on become particularly important.
Well, you talked about all the divisions that you see across Europe, and if ever there was a time when we see increasing civil unrest in some countries, and we're seeing other geopolitical issues around the world being focused on the cities, our European cities, with demonstrations and everything else. Do you think Putin sees this as an opportunity? Has he got his fingers in that pie and is stirring it deliberately because it's something he's always been good at and trying to create that and maintain that division? Or do you think he's just watching the circumstances that would have been there anyway and watching them with glee?
I think it's both. I mean, I don't think he invents these divisions, but where he can, he exploits them. And we've seen him supporting the far left, supporting for what used to be the core thing of the far left, which is anti-Americanism. That looks a bit different now, and it's Trump. But he supports the far left. He supports the far right. He also supports what I might call the greedy middle. Those big companies that would just love to get their snouts back in the troughs of and pleasure houses of Moscow. And he will support any other thing that looks like it can be helpful. He was supporting biker groups at one point because they were sort of somehow ideologically aligned. He supported people who like gun clubs. There's been all sorts of things, and often these are basically intrinsically quite innocent expressions of social or political identity. And there are many good reasons why people might want to vote for a left-wing party or a right-wing party. They're not all Putin stooges. But there's often something there that Russian, or for that matter, other intelligence services can get in and exploit. And I think there's no political force is completely immune from this. There's always the whiff, the lure of money, buying assets. So we have to be far more vigilant than we have been. And I think accept that this is not a problem that's going to be over quickly. We are facing a generational struggle now with Russia, which has this imperialist, chauvinist thinking absolutely baked in. It's going to be there for many years to come. That's
what's affecting us. Inside Russia itself, the one thing that I think Vladimir Putin is most scared of is an opposition rising up amongst the people of Russia against him. But he's managed to shield them from the conflict up until a couple of months ago, and Ukraine's attacks on the Russian oil and gas infrastructure seems to be having a huge impact on Russia's ability to put fuel in its own cars, and is bringing the war home to the Russian people. Do you think that's a significant move?
Well, I'm always very careful about this idea that we have a kind of Wunderwaffe, a magic weapon that's going to suddenly be a game changer. And history suggests that it's happened once in 1945 against Japan, but that's the exception, not the rule. So I would love to say that the Ukrainian flamingo is now going to be Ukraine's V2 and deal devastation all over Russia. But in the end, the V2 didn't save the Third Reich. So I think we need to be a bit careful about that. I think the big point is that we shouldn't personalise this about Putin. Our problems with Russia predate Putin. I was writing about these issues back in the 1990s when we were widely ridiculed and ignored for worrying that there was going to be any sort of problem with Russia. And if Putin goes, which he will eventually, I think we'll continue to have problems. But the shape of the problem may change, but this fundamental, as Radek Sikorski put in his speech at the UN General Assembly, inability to live at peace with its neighbours, that's very deeply baked in, and we're going to have to be dealing with that for years, decades to come.
Yeah, well, dealing with that decades to come. Now, you've got a column in the Times tomorrow. What are the main points coming out in that?
Everything we've talked about just now, but with a few jokes thrown in.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to a few jokes thrown in, and unfortunately, we're going to be talking about this for a long time to come. But
it's black humour, I'm afraid.
Black humour is the best humour that there is. Being ex-military, it is what keeps us going. But Edward, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today for Times Radio Frontline.
Thanks, Philip.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.